We have a microphone, so Marguerite will hand it to you. You had a question over here? Go ahead.
Thanks so much. I originally heard about your talk, Dr. Cafaro, just a couple days ago. I guess you cited to a law review note I wrote 11 years ago, and I appreciate it. This was very interesting.
Are you Steve Kelton?
I am.
Oh, good.
I
good
am
to meet
the
you.
Steve Kelton, and the premise of my law review note, which no one's addressed this morning, was that. But you mentioned how Congress is making this decision about immigration, and if it's a major federal action significantly impacting the quality of the human environment, which is most of you or many of you know is the NEPA trigger for EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, then we should do an EIS on immigration. That was the thesis of my note, and I still hope someone here could wave a magic wand and make that happen. I just want to make 2 points and then just open up one question. One is to Mr. Lin's comment about the rich having more environmental impact than maybe the poor. So true. The research shows that many of the poor immigrants who come here adopt our lifestyle, and they buy cars, and their electricity use goes up by tenfold, and water use, and et cetera. So all those immigrants coming here, they want to adopt that rich lifestyle, which greatly multiplies their impact. And then like for agricultural land, we lose about an acre per person per year. So that's about 3 million acres a year lost to, well, half to immigration, then 1.5 million to natural increase or so. So that's just a huge amount of often very productive agricultural land. So I guess one of my questions would be, immigration seems to support this concept that the gross national product has to keep growing, growth for the sake of growth. Mm-hmm. Is that like the basis of stopping immigration, is create a system where we don't just keep putting emphasis on growth and somehow emphasize quality?
I think that has to be a big part of the ultimate solution to these kinds of questions. I don't think you can create an ecologically sustainable society in the context of endlessly growing demands. And the two main ways that human demands are growing on the natural environment is through ever more people. That's a big part of it. And also just increased per capita consumption and the production that goes along with that. So if you're really looking to the long term here, I think we have to be thinking about creating societies that are about providing a sufficiency, or let's say providing a good living for the flourishing of a limited number of people, rather than providing for ever more luxury for ever more people. I think that has to be part of the answer. My own sense, and here I guess I'm disagreeing with Michael, is it's going to be a lot easier to do that regarding population than about consumption issues. I mean, the American people and many, pretty much all developed nations around the world have freely chosen to stabilize their populations, the people of those nations. It's the governments who want to bring in more people. Whereas getting people to find a way towards accepting enough in our economic lives, that's a much taller order, I think. But I think that has to be part of the answer here. And I love the point you made about the fact that people aren't moving to the United States to be poor. I think that's kind of an important point. Yeah, Michael, you're right that one billionaire is certainly consuming a lot more resources than dozens and dozens of poor Guatemalan immigrants to the U.S. But the flip side of that is there aren't that many billionaires, and there are lots of poor people from Guatemala who are moving to the U.S. or want to do that, which is fine, and we should allow some of them to come here, but we can't necessarily continue to add 3 million Americans. So I want to take away those billionaires' helicopters and jets. I'm a good progressive, but I think we also have to address population growth.
Can I exercise the chair's prerogative and introduce another issue that anyone can or cannot comment on if they want? One thing you don't talk much about is if you make the low-income population larger, does that in any way circumscribe our ability to assist the low-income population? Now, of course, if you're a libertarian or quite conservative, you'd say, hey, that ain't the state's job anyway. But playing in a kind of a progressive ballpark. So, for example, 1/3 of all children in poverty today live in an immigrant household. Does that make it harder, because you have a lot more poor children in America as a result of immigration, to do anything about uplifting low-income children? Or 1/3 of the uninsured are immigrants or their young children. Does that make it harder to provide health care to low-income people, if that's the case? And you'd think there might be some liberals who would see dramatically increasing the size of the low-income population as a kind of threat, or at least a weakening, or at least make it more difficult to help low-income people, which is, of course, a central part of progressivism. But you don't hear anybody say much about that question. A little bit on the labor market, but not on the question of, is this going to be problematic for our efforts to do anything about these things? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. I mean, when we bring in lots of poor immigrants, we're importing poverty into the United States, and then we have to deal with that. I mean, from a progressive point of view, I mean, one way to look at that is to say, these are poor people, we bring them here, it's easier to help them. I think, though, what you tend to find is, if you push that too far, and I think this has happened, you erode the kind of social cohesion that helps make people willing to redistribute wealth to help fellow citizens. I mean, I see this, I teach at a public university, and I'm always struck with how callous some of my students can be about a willingness to help their poor fellow citizens. And I'm not sure how we got from a place in this country where there seemed to be more of a consensus that we were all in this together economically. But I tend to think part of it is just, so often these days, the poorer person that you're thinking about or being asked to think about is perhaps a recent immigrant. Maybe you look at them and you say, yeah, they're doing better than they would have done in Mexico, so why should I be so concerned about this? Or maybe some of it has to do with people who are looking at people from a different ethnic or racial background, and they don't have the same concern for a person in that group. So I think I think it plays a role in the difficulty of making the case and pushing through policies that really will help alleviate poverty.
May I take a stab at this, Steve? It's a great question. I think there are a lot of progressives, and especially some people around the president, will say, well, the answer to that is we'll have a lot more. With all of these new they will organize. It will be like the civil rights movement. They will organize, and there'll be more of them, and they'll make claims on the state. And that bumps into that very important sentence in the book. We will have more people who are not citizens. So even as the poverty population grows, its political heft diminishes because they are unable to organize. And then a lot of things fade out of view. I mean, Michael ended with his rather scathing summary of Ezra Klein's argument about the native-born moving into higher skilled and supervisory jobs. Now, that is what Ezra was there saying is a vulgarization of the argument by economists that what the effect of immigration is to drive specialization, and native-born and recent immigrants will upskill and move up the chain. We have observed reality of what is happening. That's not what happens.
It doesn't seem
there are
like
only
that's
so many
what's
managers. Instead, they exit the labor force altogether. They end up on disability, which is a program, and this goes to you, which is a program which 5 years ago was simply beyond criticism, and today is, I think, one of the leading targets for budget cutters, the Social Security Disability Program, because it has grown so immensely. And I think part of that is, look, the baby boomers are aging and they're genuinely getting injured. I think it also happens during the Great Recession. You'd be a Social Security judge, and you would see a procession of 55-year-old men who did have some injury, who you realize were just never going to work again. That's obviously why they were in front of you. And your job was to say no. And you'd say no once, twice, 3 times, 60 times, 70 times, 200 times. But about the 343rd time that you see a 55-year-old man with a genuine back injury who is obviously never going to work again, your resistance cracks. You're a human being, after all. What's going to happen to that man? We have no programs for him. And we have a few, but they're maybe food stamps, but there's no way for that man to live. And so you crack and you give him Social Security disability, and we've seen the surge in the rolls. And now that program is under attack in exactly the way that you described.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think of this as it's the doom loop. If you look at the sustainable welfare states, they were economically solvent, those of Scandinavia, the New Deal system in the 1950s and 60s, because they were not redistributionist among classes. They transferred money from mostly working class people during their working years to mostly working and middle class people who were either sick or disabled or retired. So there were these horizontal transfers. It wasn't vertical. And the main mechanism for doing this was the payroll tax. And because they were universal, it was not an anti-poverty program. It was a working class, middle class safety net for non-workers. As your poverty population increases, or as wages for workers go down, payroll taxes decline. As payroll taxes decline, Simpson and Bowles and Pete Peterson say, oh my God, compared to, suddenly the Social Security payroll tax shortfall is much worse. Medicare and Medicaid shortfall is much worse. We have to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, right? And at that point, I don't know whether they're naive or astrategic or, maybe just, cunningly Machiavellian progressives come along and say, yes, we agree, we should cut these universal middle class entitlements, the sort of incumbent, privileges Dave was talking about. But what we'll do is we'll increase benefits for the poor, increasingly foreign-born, and we'll make up the difference by slashing Medicare and Social Security for the native working class, white, but also of other races. So at that point, this incumbency dynamic that David is talking about is accelerated. So the people who are now being told, not that you're rich and you can afford a cut in Social Security benefits, but you make more than $40,000 or $50,000 a year or something. So, and you're not going to get the EITC. You're not. And as far as I can tell, the plan of the mainstream progressive movements is what David mentioned. That is, in fact, Klein. I'm sorry to pick on Ezra Klein. I'm a great admirer of his, and he's a brilliant journalist. It just seems here he is expressing the conventional wisdom. In the same Wonk blog post I quote, he says, well, yeah, wages will go down somewhat because of immigration, but you can just increase the welfare state. Increase the welfare state. By which he means tested programs for lower income workers, right? So your immigrant competitor lowers your wages by 20%, but then we're going to tax all Americans to add you and give you 20% more income through the earned income tax credit or something like that, although it's means-tested program. So you cut out the middle class and the upper middle class and so on. Now, if you're I think of myself as a real progressive. If you're real progressive, this is corporatist crony capitalism at its worst. Right. That is, if you're real progressive, you're against socializing the costs and privatizing the profits. But what you're actually doing is you're privatizing the profits for employers of low-wage labor, and you're socializing the costs by raising taxes on everybody else in America to subsidize these workers who can't live on what they're being paid. And it's a mystery to me that maybe Mike Huckabee will do it, I don't know, that someone on the left or the right or the center does not make the case that it's actually the employers and the consumers who should pay the subsistence costs of workers through higher wages or higher product and goods and services costs. It's not the taxpayers.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Peggy. Oh, wait, there's a microphone.
I'm Peggy Archowski. I'm the congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook magazine. So I write a lot about Latinos, and it's just amazing to me how people, especially Democrats, are missing the incredible diversification that's going on among Latinos. I'm talking to more and more who, especially native-born, who are millennials, not so political, but also increasingly American nationals. And I think there's starting to be a big crack in the whole civil rights argument for immigration. I tell people openly, look, immigration is not a civil right, and it's certainly not a civil right to be in the country illegally. And they kind of go, and then they go, oh, well, yeah. I'm wondering if I think there's a lot of cracks. I think the manicurist story is a perfect hypocrisy of liberals. And so far, all the stories the New York Times have written about the manicurists, there isn't one thing that this is an issue about, a sanctuary city who supports illegal immigration. So I think there's a lot of places that one can attack this very liberal idea. And I'm wondering, are you seeing any movement among the blacks about this? They are the ones who are being hurt the most. The Fergusons and the Baltimores, most of those stores that were burned were owned by immigrants. They're not hiring blacks. Anyway, are you seeing that?
Well, we let the panelists answer that question.
I just want, David, what was the term you used? Incumbency, what?
Incumbent claims.
Incumbency claim, okay.
Does anyone want to take a shot?
A few years ago, I was at a progressive conference. An African-American leader of an urban coalition told me that, we're getting wiped out by immigration, I'm not going to name any of these individuals. Yeah. And said, but I can't say this because it will endanger my foundation funding, right? Because the way the Progressive Coalition works is the environmentalists can't complain about immigration. The urban African-American opportunity people can't complain about it because they're all funded by big foundations which kind of orchestrate the party lines. That's just anecdotal evidence. But the other interesting statistics about Latinos is, well, to one thing, they are diverse. I mean, Cuban Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Mexican Americans, quite diverse. Mainly, largely, if you look at Mexican Americans, according to Gregory Rodriguez, in this decade, I think, the number of native-born Mexican Americans will surpass that of immigrants for the first time since the 1960s or 70s. And he argues that's going to create a radical shift. Because if you look at assimilation rates, and here I think the nativists on the right are just mistaken. Mexican Americans lose Spanish and marry outside of the group at pretty much the same rate as Germans and Poles and Irish, and others did. So the assumption of today's Democrats that an ever-growing Latino population is just this escalator, and the other Democratic groups are just going to ride it to permanent majority status. I'm not sure. I'm from Texas. If you look at Texas, there are more and more Mexican-American Republicans. And it makes sense strategically. That is, do you want to be the sacrificial lamb candidate your whole life and never hold office? Or do you want to work within the one party in your one-party state? So I think, yeah, all of this is coming under question.
I have a question over here.
Stephen Duffield. I'm an attorney here in town. I'm curious about the political opportunism, let's put it that way, that David talks about. And I actually wanted to get Michael's response to it as well. And I want to flesh it out a little bit more before I do. What we see right now is something that was slightly on the table in 12, but is very clearly on the table in 16, which is what I generally call, because it's my old world when I worked in the Senate, it's the Jeff Sessions argument of today. And I know a lot of that is what CIS has worked on and others here. But by focusing more on low-wage labor in particular, you now see an openness with some of the candidates. Scott Walker's clearly opening himself up to having that conversation later. I don't think he's actually made the argument yet, but he's actually ready to do it if he wants. Senator Santorum is ready to have the argument. If he chooses to run, he'll certainly have a voice and he'll make the argument more. I think that others will be open to this generally, and I think we're going to have a much more direct fight within the Republican Party over immigration as it relates to low-wage labor in particular. And what it ends up doing is it is filling a vacuum, right? So you have this vacuum that we've been discussing that progressives are kind of walking away from these economic arguments that, when I was working in the Senate in the 06-07 era, when they were working on the immigration bills, you had a robust fight within the left about what to do on these issues, and now you don't. But it was live then. Now it's gone. Now there's a power vacuum. Now you see people moving over and on the right and grabbing those arguments and creating opportunities for themselves. So I'm curious, I'd be curious to hear, and I've read some that you've written, obviously, on this, but I'm curious what your current thought is on that. And I'm actually curious from the left how you see that playing out, if there's a way that the elbows can come out and a shield can be erected on the left with these traditional populist groups from the left, economic populism, such that conservatives, Republicans can't take advantage of this shift. And if that breaks down over time, and I'm curious, but to start with, if you wanted to flesh that out at all, thinking about how politics naturally works, we're going to fill this vacuum, and can the left stop that from happening if they're not going to fight this fight?
People don't invent their own political languages. They have to use the political languages that are available to them. And so new ideas often express themselves very haltingly using old language. And that's why the Tea Party invoked so often libertarian phrases, even as what it was really doing was defending Medicare for people like themselves. And they didn't have a language to do that. They were Republicans. They didn't know how to defend a welfare state that had previously been uncontroversial. And for everybody, it was now under pressure because the Obamacare financing system was redistributive away from Medicare, and because they could look ahead and see challenges to Medicare. I wrote a long article for Foreign Affairs about this, and one of the core things you can see happening in the Obama years is that the baby boom generation, defined as the people born between 1945 and 60, had historically been quite a bit more liberal than the previous generation born between 1930 and 1945. And suddenly, between about 2007 and 2012, they catch up, and they become just as conservative as people 15 years older. What does that mean? What it means is that they are very hostile to all other social welfare programs besides Social Security and Medicare. And in fact, they're even more hostile to changes in Medicare than are their seniors, than the people 15 years older. I fancifully speculate that what was happening is a lot of people were 75 were saying, well, Medicare will see me out. Won't be the American government doesn't move that fast. But people who are 58 and 62 think it'll move fast enough. And so hands off my program. So we're seeing an attempt to have that discussion within the Republican Party. Mike Huckabee is having some of that conversation. I think one of the things that you hear in the Republican debates is you'll hear so often an elegiac tone for the world as it was. This will often be expressed in terms of safety. When we were younger, the world was much safer. Kids could. That's crazy. That's just completely false. The world there was more crime. There were more accidents. I remember my father building a jungle gym on top of a cement floor. So we have a home video of this, and it's just unfathomable to me. I mean, they're just. I don't know how any child born in the 1960s actually survived those 10 years. No seatbelts, people smoking in cars. But the way it is different is that the middle class, the country that was once a middle class oriented country has stopped being that. And I think those baby boom voters are groping for their language. And that is the argument that we're seeing. I don't know quite that it will happen. I'll take one more sentence on this yet. Because look, the organized wealth is wealthier and more organized than ever, and it has enormous impact on the on the process of selecting party nominees, and it's the views of Republican donors on the immigration question are very clear and very self-conscious and understand and self-serving. I don't blame people for serving their interests, but what has happened in politics generally, and this is something that Michael alluded to that's important, is how much of American political life has ceased being self-financing. that the AFL-CIO did not live on grants. But in a society that is increasingly, where wealth is increasingly concentrated, politics is increasingly funded by few, even though it is participated in by many. And he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Well, Professor Cafaro has his recommendations at the end. Cut legal immigration from 1.1 million to 300,000 per year. Reduce illegal immigration by mandating use of a national employment verification system, essentially the demand side of employers, which was the recommendation of the Jordan Commission and the Hesburgh, every commission.
That's right.
Rework trade agreements to help people in their own countries as opposed to treating this as charity. You could probably get the Mike Huckabee voters and the Elizabeth Warren voters to agree on this if you explain this to them. Now, in the case of the progressive voters, there'd have to be an amnesty. I think at this point, a clean amnesty where you make people citizens as quickly as possible is in the interest of the working people of America, because you do not want a society where the labor market is divided among different groups of workers with different rights. This was the Lincoln Republicans, it was the progressives. You want everyone to have exactly the same rights, to quit the job, take another one, vacations, otherwise employers will pit different groups against each other. And it's unfair. The right populists have to swallow this enormous unfairness that these people have jumped the lines. But if they can be reassured that this isn't going to happen every 20 years, I think that's it. The problem is, as David mentioned, it's the producer interests. And they're really two. There's the tech community, which wants more H-1Bs. And I'm in favor of a more skilled immigration, particularly if it takes the form of, like in Europe, it's a blue card. You just come here, and then you can quit your job and go to any other job, or a green card. I don't want to have green cards stapled to college diplomas. That's a popular proposal, because there will be 500 new diploma mills will spring up the next week to give Saudi royal kids green cards. So that's a stupid idea. But, sure, you want Albert Einstein and Alexander Graham Bell. The problem is most H-1Bs are not geniuses. They're doing stuff that, American high school or college graduates can do. It's just for lower wages. They're indentured servants. They can't quit their job. They live in terror of these body shops that they work for, these contracts. So it's a nightmare thing. But so that's the tech sector producerism. And then there's, the landscape gardeners and the dairy farmers and all of this. And the problem with U.S. and with most democracies is producer interests have enormous influence over the legislature because they're small but intense. They have their one, whereas the people who suffer from this are very diffuse and scattered. And so, and to me it's fascinating, the politics of this. The producers have actually killed their own immigration reform repeatedly, because you say, okay, we'll expand maybe legal immigration a little. We'll have an amnesty for the 12, 14 million who are here. And at that point, when they're writing the bill, the lobbyists come in and say, okay, we'll have 1 million guest workers a year for agribusiness. And then the whole thing falls apart. I mean, correct me if I'm mistaken, but again and again, this guest worker stuff has killed this, because at that point, labor, and the progressives and the populists pull back, as they rightly should, So, I don't know how you get around that. Now, in the case of the progressives, my final point, I watched all of this in the last immigration reform thing that fell apart. I think that agribusiness and these other low-wage employer lobbies are holding amnesty hostage to the guest worker thing. That's the only way I can explain why otherwise progressive people. Now, the Economic Policy Institute, there are some who do go after the guest worker stuff on economic and civic grounds. But I think essentially they persuaded Latinos and labor, if you shut up about the new guest workers,
Right.
the H-2s, we'll give you amnesty. And of course, ironically, they didn't have the power to give them amnesty. And actually, the guest worker thing turned out to be a poison pill.
It certainly was one of the big drags on. I mean, it's a complicated debate, but yeah. Well,
Steve, quick point.
right.
I think we're in a really strange place in our politics when we're depending on Jeff Sessions to bring up these populist economic arguments that progressives should be making about the impacts of flooded labor markets on American workers. And, you know, I wrote this book to get progressive politicians and media folks. They don't have to come out in the same place that I do, but just discussing these issues realistically. I mean, there's a robust debate among conservatives, and it looks like it's possible we're going to have a robust debate among the conservative presidential candidates. We need to have those kind of debates among Democrats. You might wind up continuing to support 1 million immigrants annually, but you should debate it, get the pros and cons out there, understand that there are trade-offs in different policies. We need to have that debate.
I'll take 2 more quick questions if we have. Paul, go ahead. Just don't make it too long, and then I'll go to Jerry.
I'm Paul Donnelly. I helped to pass the last permanent increase in legal immigration back in 1990, and I continue my long and checkered career in this stuff. I want to take exception to one thing Dr. Gafara said, which is the notion that governments do this to us, and to suggest that it's helpful to make the distinctions that matter. I haven't read carefully your 1.1 million, but my guess is that includes refugees, who are people we will not turn away, and who are admitted to the United States primarily for foreign policy reasons. It includes illegal immigration. Illegal immigration is something we don't want. That's why it's illegal. You can argue about what we want to do about it, but the fact that it's illegal is a clue that we don't like it. Then you have legal immigration. And I've often talked to people about, well, what's the difference? It's really simple. Legal immigrants are people who are invited individually, by name, by Americans. Now, there are some exceptions to that. There's the diversity lottery, for example. But family and employment-based immigration, which is what legal immigration really is based upon an individual American who invites an individual foreigner to join us in America. So it's not the government that's doing this, it's individual Americans. And the Jordan Commission, where I was the communications director, the commissioners voted that Congress, which does indeed set all this policy, should set priorities, and the numbers should flow from the priorities. It should not be a number picked out of the air, and then you figure out how many people you're willing to fit into that number from which categories. Current family and employment-based immigration is very simple. Spouses and kids of U.S. citizens, spouses and kids of legal permanent residents, adult children of both legal permanent residents and U.S. citizens, siblings of U.S. citizens. That's it. And then you've got skill-based immigration, employment-based immigration. That's where the numbers come from. Congress likes to manage by backlog because it promises more than it delivers, and backlogs create illegal immigration. So it's real simple. Which categories are you going to cut, and how are you going to tell Americans they can't invite their siblings or their parents anymore?
Who wants to answer that?
Yeah, I'd like to take a crack at that. I mean, currently, so-called family reunification slots are generating about 650,000 immigrants into the U.S. annually, and that's way more than Congress ever intended. It's simply an endless chain of ever more people, especially when you include adult children, when you include the siblings of people who have immigrated here previously. So if you decide to stick with that program, what you're essentially saying is that we can never cut back on immigration because it's a program that naturally leads to more and more. And you know, to talk about this as people inviting people in, it sounds warm and homey, but the reality is employers want cheap labor, and they're always going to invite more people in so they can drive down the wages of American workers. Congress needs to get on this and get serious about setting immigration policies that make sense for Americans and that make sense for Americans down the line several generations.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, I'd like to ask anyone
Hold on, wait till we get the mic.
to discuss the performance of the press in informing this debate you say you want to have about the connection between unskilled immigration in particular and the growing divide between rich and poor in the U.S.
I can speak to, I have a very anecdotal, I can give you an anecdote that sort of sums this up. I debate the economics of immigration a lot, and I debate it with some pretty sophisticated financial journalists. And when I debate them, I will always hear from the citation of the Perry models. They don't always know who wrote the model, but they know the model about the economic consequences. But I've never encountered. I wrote an article for The Atlantic about this. Do they know how the model is made? Because economic journalists tend not to be economists. Or that interested in the difficulties of economics. And they tend to be overly impressed. Economics generates highly, Friedrich Hayek has a wonderful word, scientistic, as opposed to scientific. Economics is scientistic, that it generates highly specific looking answers based on models that are extremely crude representations of reality. And when you start taking the models apart, and one of the model that we were talking before with Ezra Klein is where you assume that people are driven up the skill chain. How is that model made? It's made. One of the crucial things is whenever somebody exits the workforce, you stop counting them. You're like, that doesn't seem a highly realistic economic assumption, but they vanish from the modeling once they're out of the workforce because you're contrasting and comparing pairs of workers in different parts of the workforce. So I would say that in a way you would like either a better informed press or a worse informed press, either a press that had never heard of economic models or a press that understood how those models are made. But what we have right now is an elite press in particular that cites them, thinking that they are science rather than just very crude social science approximations of complex realities.
Well, the elite press practices ruthless censorship of any. I'll give you 3 anecdotes for what it's worth. One time in the 90s, I was around the time of the Jordan Commission. An editor at the New York Times op-ed page solicited me to do a piece on the downsides of mass immigration. She got a phone call from the publisher complaining, why is she running all of these anti-immigration op-eds? Well, it turns out the ratio is like 3-to-1 pro and con, right?
But even that was too much.
Yeah, she soon was no longer working at the op-ed page. When I was a staff writer at the New Yorker, I quoted a previous generation of New Republic liberals who'd made the case that you can't have a welfare state and open borders, something that Milton Friedman famously agreed with. One of my colleagues in the next issue devoted a long article denouncing me, saying that his grandmother was an immigrant, Ellis Island, et cetera. I said, well, yeah, my great-grandmother's an immigrant. That's not an argument. Marty Peretz, the publisher of the New Republic, then compelled me to join him at an event at the Holocaust Museum with a bunch of pro-immigration activists, at which an obviously doctored photo was distributed of a 12-year-old girl from Cuba fleeing on a boat. And in this obviously doctored photo, we were told that she was playing the violin, playing God Bless America as she sank beneath the waves. So I kind of got the point of that.
Wow.
A few years later, a leading liberal magazine asked me to come up with 5 or 6 proposals, what you could do to drive up wages. So most of them, greater union bargaining power. So one of them was less unskilled immigration. So the editor told me, I can't publish anything critical of immigration in this magazine. I'll get in trouble with the publisher. So I said, well, either publish it or I'm never writing for you again. I've never written for that magazine again. And so there is a huge difference between the openness on this issue of the actual academics, like Krugman, although I note he wrote that piece about the economics of immigration in 2007. He was just, attacked. And he hasn't returned to the subject since, to my knowledge.
That's right.
So essentially, you either get attacked by the activists as a racist and a Nazi. I was on Ezra Klein's, what was the list server called? Journalist. Yeah, so I made this point one time. And then 30 leading Washington journalists, I'm Hitler, I'm a Nazi, this is racism, et cetera. And the curious thing is there's a divorce between the groupthink of the Atlantic, New Republic, Salon, Slate, et cetera, editors and journalists, In the actual Democratic electorate, which has quite different views, the Democratic professoriate, by and large, so what do you attribute this to? And I attribute it essentially, I'm become more and more a non-Marxist historical materialist. It's class. That is, most of the people who work in the press are upper middle class people with extreme economic ambitions for themselves and their children, and they live in expensive cities in Washington and New York. And if they're not independently wealthy, their lifestyle is enabled by low-wage nannies, low-wage maids, low-wage takeout. So even if they're willing to go against their interest in the manicures, even if they're willing to get their own personal professional class interest, their magazine is owned by a billionaire who has the billionaire's view of the world. We found out recently from polls in Chicago, Gillen's and these other social scientists, that most rich Democrats and rich Republicans agree on almost everything. They want to increase immigration. They're in favor of public investment in things that benefit them, like infrastructure. Everything else should be cut. And this is the rich Democrats. Cut Social Security, cut Medicare, cut SSI, all of that. So that's the thing. The problem with magazines of opinion is the guy who owns the magazine. It's the publisher's opinion. That's the old saying.
I have one comment on that, and I do think it relates here. One of the areas where the media seems to be the worst is even discussing legal immigration. For example, so the Gang of Eight, at least for the first 10 years, doubled the flow of foreign workers in the United States. Now, you'd think that would have been an important aspect of that bill that ultimately went down to defeat. We'd have a lot of debate on that. Everything focused on the legalization, the amnesty provisions, if you will, and some of the enforcement stuff. But the fact that we would double immigration and have basically no national debate about legislation that was being debated is extraordinary, and certainly probably much more important than the amnesty, and yet almost nobody covered it. And the one time I pressed a journalist, he said, well, no one else is talking about it. That was sort of the answer. And so I guess if no one else is talking about it, it must not be a story.
So I think the answer to this obvious problem is for everyone to buy 5 copies of this book and to send it to your journalists out there writing
On
your
the
newspaper.
issue. All right, what a nice way to end it. Well, I want to thank everyone, including all of our panelists and all of you for coming. A video of this will be, of course, made available shortly and be posted at our website. Thank you again.